don't want to slum it in 1080p, Josh. Come on. 4K all the way.
We're going to do that, or let's have a conversation.
Okay. I'm just over here clapping like an idiot. College football nerds, we have made it through the preseason. It is time to talk live action college football that's coming up this week. We have a huge announcement. We're going to make this announcement in every single one of our videos this week to hammer the point home because you're going to want to get involved. I'm going to start with what we're announcing involves a monthly prize. For September, it's $500 cash. That may help you listen while we explain what it is. collegefootballnerds.com. Our goal is to make the best college football statistics-driven site in the world, and we want to make it accessible, so it's not just total nerd stuff. It's normal statistics and a little bit of advanced statistics too. But there's a lot more going on, and Josh is going to explain some of it. I'm going to explain some of it, and a lot of it is stuff that y'all have been asking for. We've got normal box scores, schedules, player stats, rankings, and all that. It's there. It's easy to find. Here's some cool stuff we're doing. NFL statistics by team. So if you're an Alabama fan, you can go one click and see all of the Alabama players in the NFL and their stats on any given week and over the whole season. NFLU rankings, we're going to do that too. We've got a weekly pick'em, and we're doing monthly prizes. That way, if you forget one and forget to do one, you're not out for the year. Weekly pick'em for September. The winner, $500 cash. We're going to do prizes every month, and that pick'em is also going to inform on our top 25. Top 25, we're waiting until week 4. We're not just going to launch one now, and you're going to get a vote. So every time you log in, every week, once a week, you can fill out a top 25. And how well you do in the pick'em is going to inform our model on how much weight to weigh your entry for that week. Super awesome stuff. I got some other stuff to talk about, but I'm going to turn it over to Josh to explain how we've worked our model.
And realize this is generation 1 for us, but we're trying to expose as much as we can. So for years, we've been running this model and putting it in our videos. I've been doing it largely by hand as a combination of scraping data on a lot of team and player statistics, running that through a jury-rigged thing I had in Excel and other places where I'm trying to basically code in a lot of fancy math to do projections based on those statistics. We have it automated. So come week 4, we're going to launch the model on the page. So you're going to be able to take the model, pick a team, pick another team, and project the result under our model. And a lot of the intermediate statistics that we've generated as part of the model, we're going to try to expose to you guys. So the first thing you're going to see is we're going to call it relative performance or expected performance. What that basically means, we talk about percentage of opponent averages. It's a little bit wordy, so we're going to change that name to relative performance. But basically, if you're playing teams that are allowing 4 yards per carry to all their other opponents, and then you get 5 yards per carry versus them, you exceeded their average by 25%. So rather than just giving you total yardage or yard per play, we're actually going to give you a statistic that says, how well did you do versus those teams versus how well they did against everyone else? And then using some of the internals of our model, we're also going to talk about what expected performance is for a given team. So we know what your total yardage statistics, passing yardage, rushing statistics should be given who you've played. Our axiom has always been that college football is very much determined by your level of competition. And because of that, we've always tried to find ways to have stats that really balance that in a way that people can understand and read. So right now, our goal is to get those in front of you. We've got to wait a few weeks because we need real game data to be able to calculate those statistics and not have them completely off the wall. But come week 4, the model will be available. Those statistics will be available. And over time, we hope to add a lot more advanced statistics as we can. But right now, building a website, we're just trying to get the key pieces in front of you first, make sure they're working. Hopefully everything works out of the gate. There might be some glitches, but hopefully everything does. And then we're going to keep adding statistics over time that are accessible for everyone.
That's coming. The model's going to be open to everybody to use. The top 25 is coming. We're going to release it every week. I know this is a long open before we talk about LSU and before we talk about Florida State, but we want to hammer it home, get in that pick'em. The sign-up is free, but you can use the stats even without signing up. But if you want to do the pick'em, the top 25, if you want to have a place that you can go immediately see your team stats, team schedule, box scores, NFL players, all in one click, you're going to want to sign up, collegefootballnerds.com. check it out. Josh, now that that's over, we said 2 minutes. I think it was like 5 minutes. Y'all can skip ahead, I hope, in the video if you wanted to get past it. Let's talk LSU. Let's talk Florida State. This game is obviously the game of the opening of the season. And, you know, we've got Alabama, Texas in a couple of weeks, but right now this is like the marquee game. And there's some other really good games this week. But because of how crazy this game was last year and how unexpectedly good for some people these two teams did last year, there's a lot of expectation riding on this game. But we said it in our previews that nobody watched. Our Florida State preview was the best one we did all summer, and nobody watched it. Y'all need to go watch it. Josh, let's start by celebrating these two teams in an era where teams are skirting good, strong, out of conference competition. LSU, Florida State playing a big time game that they didn't even have to play.
Yeah, it's a big deal that these two teams are playing and made an effort to play. I mean, you have to bear in mind Florida State already plays Florida out of conference every year, so this is a 10th P5 game. You know, especially when you consider the strength of these teams, the fact that Florida State has been trying to build something, you got to give them a lot of credit for scheduling it. LSU, year in and year out, always tries to schedule big marquee out-of-conference games. They have been very successful in those games. Last year, it probably hurt them on a national stage to play Florida State and lose in an opener where both these teams are trying to figure things out. I'm sure LSU and Florida State fans both have opinions on who would have won the game later in the year, but that's conjecture. But the point is that they're making a point to play the games, and they're not shying away from competition. They continue to schedule these sorts of games, and I think both of them should be celebrated for doing that because I think it's really important for us in trying to evaluate the sport, but two, also just for the enjoyability of it. You know, I fear for the day when we go to a 12 or 16 team playoff and they stop bothering to schedule these games because you might as well just win your conference or get fourth in the SEC and make it to the playoff. These games are a huge part of what makes college football special.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing that we noted in our previews this summer was the good thing about this game for both teams is you learn a lot about yourself. One of y'all is going to leave with a huge win, but the other one, because there's respect for this game being played, you're not out of the race. Like, whoever loses this game is not out of the national championship hunt. They're still eligible for the playoffs. That's what I wish more teams would realize is that out-of-conference game – you can still go and win your conference and make the playoffs just fine. So I think that we need to really, like I said, celebrate that. Josh, these two teams had unexpected, really good seasons last year. There's a lot of hype coming in this year. A lot of it is warranted. One of the things that we noted in the Florida State preview is people don't realize how good Jordan Travis was last year. There were only 2 Power 5 quarterbacks who had better yard per attempt averages than them. But the other thing we noted for people who didn't see the preview is that defense was a bit of a concern last year in stretches. Is this game a situation where if you were going to pick, given what we know about these teams last year and given all the transfers on defense for LSU this year, that it might end up being another shootout?
It has a bit of that feel. There's so many transfers in this game. Let me say this first off, that it's hard to track, right? The secondaries for both of these teams, the front sevens for both of these teams, everything is really hard to project because there's so many moving pieces, and so many of those pieces are transfers. LSU in particular got 2 guys that were all conference level guys, but at a lower level of football, they're probably going to start at corner for them. The defensive backfield situation with Denver Harris and a lot of other moving things means I don't really know what their 6 DB lineup really looks like right now. I've got a little bit of concerns from a nickel or dime perspective. So it's just all really uncertain. But what I do know is that offensively they both return a lot of talent and a lot of weapons. Jordan Travis is underrated because as good as Jayden Daniels was to end the year in clutch moments, in terms of an overall passer, in terms of statistic proficiency, Jordan Travis was by far the better quarterback through the course of last year. That's not a shot on Daniels. That's more a statement, if you took it that way, of how much a lot of people seriously underestimate how good Travis actually was. As you said, really the third highest rated passer last year. So it does have all the potentials to be a shootout. The problem is it has the potential to be a shootout, but it's also probably, and we said this last year, but even maybe more so this year, one of the most uncertain games that you could possibly have given the amount of turnover on the rosters. And, just kind of given the fact that it's week 1 and I have no idea who's going to really start for these teams, much less how good those starters are going to be.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge, and we've said this about a lot. There's a lot of teams that have to rely on transfers. Ole Miss relies a lot on transfers, and the culture there, to me, is not one that really is conducive to bringing those transfers in and folding them into your culture. I think Kelly at LSU is the opposite. They're going to rely on transfers, and I think that he just breeds an environment that will allow them to fit in quickly and, figure it out, or they're not playing, and really contribute, because getting the culture fit right is half the battle when you're bringing in a bunch of transfers. So I don't know that it's necessarily a negative. I think that there's a little bit of concern there, just given how many and how some are expected to start. But I think that there's an opportunity there for them to really have not fall off just because they have a bunch of transfers. Josh, I know we're going there's the point spread here is 2.5 points. LSU's favored by 2.5 points. The over-under is 58.5, which to me doesn't scream shootout. What do you think Vegas is seeing in this game versus we'll talk about, what we think about this game in a second, but what do you think Vegas is seeing? Cue all the people in the comments that say, well, they're just trying to make money in the middle. They're also not going crazy, setting some ridiculous spread.
Well, last year, I think when we watched these two teams in the opener, they had a bit of a hard time getting going. It's really rare for an offense to come out of the gate and look just polished and clicking in week 1. And sometimes defenses have issues with busts and tackling and things like that, and that creates some random points, and that really just adds volatility to it. But offense is often more about rhythm, and it's hard to have rhythm. There was a statistic in the Notre Dame Navy game, which, God bless them, Notre Dame looks a lot improved, and something we're going to probably talk about the next few weeks. But Navy was also just looking really bad.
Terrible.
But they looked terrible. There were plays when you're running 4 verts, guys shouldn't be running free down the middle of the field. And yeah, Hartman would have pressure and throw it up, and Navy is a pressure-based defense. But oh my gosh, it was just bad. But one of the statistics they threw up was that Navy, I think scored 17 points total in their last 3 openers. It's hard for teams sometimes to come out in an opener and look good. That was a triple option team. Triple option teams get a lot better as the year goes along. They start really rough every year. And every year we always feel like, oh, wow, football took a huge step back, because people forget the progression, right? They expect the team that ended in December that had weeks and weeks of rhythm to show up and be good again. And that's just not the case. But I think there's probably less continuity than some people want to give it credit for. I'll say a couple of things on the LSU side. 7 of 11 leading tacklers are gone. 7 of 11 leading tacklers. And there's a lot of transfers, and a lot of those leading tacklers, particularly in the secondary, frankly, were not really high-level players, which is probably why Vegas is optimistic, but especially given how good some of the transfers are. But that's a lot of guys gone. But offensively, the moniker I've heard a lot is that there's 10 of 11 returning starters on offense. That's not really true. Bradford, Boutte, and Jenkins were really all starters. Boutte and Jenkins were 2 of the top 3 receivers there with Neighbors. Bradford did start on the offensive line. This is really a team that's returning 8 of 11, not 10 of 11 starters on offense. There's more reason to be a little slow out of the gate in some ways than people want to give it credit for. That's the thing I want you to take away from it. And frankly, with both these teams being so good, with the fact that you kind of know what the offensive scheme is going to be from the opponent, I think the expectation is also the fact that the defenses are going to be well prepared for the offenses. And if you look at games with a lot of time off, be it bowl games like national championship games or openers, frequently the defenses have an edge. I don't know how many times you watch a national title game where you have an elite offense that shows up for the title game and they just get slowed to a crawl. The 2010 title game is always one that sticks in my mind, where Oregon and Auburn had these incredibly powerful offenses that no one could stop, and that game ended up being a slugfest. I think that comes down a lot to just being able to prepare for offenses, particularly when you have mobile quarterbacks that like to run the ball and they use motion and a lot of trickery to get them on the edges. That stuff's going to be pretty well clamped down defensively. And both these teams are not necessarily so driven to be explosive in the passing game. They have vertical components. I'm not saying they're not dangerous, but it's not their bread and butter to go vertical every play. They like to try to grind things out on the ground and shake guys free underneath, and that's going to be made hard. So I think that's what Vegas is seeing. You can chalk it up to a little bit of turnover, a lot of uncertainty, and then also the fact that there's a lot of time off to prepare.
So you and I disagreed a little bit on LSU's wide receiver room. You know, we had this whole – you had a really great long segment last week on why wide receivers are really important in gauging potential to really hit the ground running. Like returning wide receivers, returning cornerbacks really is what's driving college football right now, more than even offensive line, defensive line, which has been historically what we thought about. I don't think losing Boutte is a huge loss. And I think from a talent standpoint, yes, but I think that he was a little bit, especially earlier in the season, just the attitude on the field, and he might have been a little bit of a locker room cancer. It just, that's kind of the feeling I got. That's not based on anything other than conjecture. I think Malik Nabers is one of the best wide receivers in the country. Like, I think he is top 3 off the draft board kind of good. And I don't know that, I don't know that who they're replacing from last year, even though they're replacing a lot of sum total production. I don't know that it's going to be that hard to replace. Maybe let's kind of revisit that discussion. I think it's an interesting one.
Yeah, so the point I'd made, and this goes to the returning starters thing. Look, this point I'm about to make you can argue with. The point about returning starters, it's just true. I mean, those guys were starters. And the point that leads into Boutte was not a very effective receiver over the course of the year, especially the start of the year. He was inconsistent. The Florida State game at the beginning of the year, mentally inconsistent with catching the football, running his routes, kind of everything. But Boutte also did lead the team in receiving in 3 of their last 6 games, which I think doesn't really get enough attention. And in fact, Jenkins led in a 4th. So those 2 guys, Boutte and Jenkins, actually led the team in receiving in 4 of the last 6 games of the season. The Georgia game, where LSU offensively kind of exploded with Nussmeier at quarterback, Nabers was the guy that actually led in that game in receiving, but Boutte also had over 100 yards. So the thing that I had kind of noted in the discussion, and I'll push back on now, is I do think the loss is probably a little more significant than a lot of people want to give it credit for. I agree with you. I think Nabers is easily one of the best receivers in the country. He makes my first team All-American team. Let me be really clear on that. And I think he's going to be a dangerous guy that's going to be hard to contain. But I think there's a little bit of underestimating how good that receiving core was as a whole, especially given the fact that they could go really 4 or 5 deep. You could put Brian Thomas Jr. on the field, and he did play quite a bit late in the year. But every receiver generally is made better by the next guy on the field. And when you have a whole bunch of them that are really good, it lets you create a lot of matchup advantages that you can't do if they're not, right? Because if Nabers is in the slot on a safety, you can't necessarily cheat over too much if the guys on the outside are Boutte and Jenkins, because they're too dangerous for you to compromise in coverage on them. And now I think the other receivers are really good, but if you look at the depth chart, right, Thomas Jr. I think is going to be solid as a second receiver. But beyond that, Anderson, Lacey, Brown, Hilton, I don't know which of those guys is going to be the kind of weapon that Jenkins and Boutte were. And so I think from a rotation standpoint, from a standpoint of being able to be multiple in your alignments, they're probably a little bit more limited. And I say this now, and some of these young guys may explode and prove me wrong, but I do know that the talents they had, especially when they were in a 3-wide set last year, it may not have necessarily been the best receiving core in the country, but in terms of raw talent, it arguably might have been the most talented set of 3 receivers. And there were a lot of games where they didn't show up, to your point. But again, in crunch time late in the year, like that Alabama game, it was Boutte that led LSU in receiving against Alabama in that win. And so I do think the impact of those departures is going to matter over the course of the year. If whether or not that is in week 1 remains to be seen.
I would argue that the issue is not going to be returning starters or returning production. It's going to be if they can find in their either whatever the scheme problem was or the quarterback problem was, where Jayden Daniels had 7.5 yards per attempt, which is not good. It's fine. But more concerning to me is outside of the exactly 15.0 yards per catch that Jenkins had, nobody had 15 yards. Like, you got a lot of 11, 10, 11, 11, 12. I'm going down the list. You got to have more explosion at wide receiver to have an elite offense if your desires are and your expectations are to make the playoffs or to build on what you had last year. And that's kind of hidden in their numbers is they had a lot of guys that were, I had 400 yards receiving and I was catching about 10 and a half yards a catch. That's not great. And when it's across the board like that and when your quarterback has a low YPA, there's something going on there schematically or at quarterback that they've got to sort out. And I think that they probably can. Look, it was year one under Kelly, year one with Daniels. They're going to be better. The question is it going to be enough? I got one more question for you or one more topic for you before we go into picks. So people didn't realize how deadly Stetson Bennett was in that Georgia offense and why a lot of it was because he had been there for 36 years. This year, we've got a quarterback in Jayden Daniels that's his first year playing was 2019, but across the field, Jordan Travis, his first year was 2018, and he took snaps every year, 2018, 19, all the way up through last year. Is there a hidden really big advantage? Let's just focus on Jordan Travis. Really big advantage of having a guy leading a team of players who know how to win now because they had a 10-win season last year, leading a team like that who's been playing for that long?
I think so. There's a lot of advantages in terms of being able to be in the right formation, scheme fit. And last year, it's important to remember Daniels was a transfer. I don't think he had a full grasp of the offense. You had a new coaching staff. There's reason to be optimistic for the fact that Daniels is going to take a step forward. I don't think it's reasonable to expect him to take a Joe Burrow level step forward because that was kind of a once-in-a-generation type of thing. But to take a big step forward because he's going to understand the offense well enough and he's been around long enough to understand an offense to that degree. Same deal with Jordan Travis. The biggest advantages for these teams in a lot of cases has been the running game, which is something we haven't really talked a lot about, right? Trey Benson ended up being an emerging star for Florida State. Over the offseason, the reports were that he got a lot bigger and stronger. I remember when I watched him, he was explosive, but he really wasn't big enough to play at this level to be as effective as he should be. I mean, he was a good player, but he didn't have the size to quite take the steps that he needed to take and to be as effective on a consistent basis as you'd like. Same sort of deal with LSU. LSU's rushing attack with Jayden Daniels, Josh Williams, Noah Cain, Emory. It was the run games that often made these teams click, going first through the quarterback, second through the running backs. And when you've got guys that understand the offense this well, look, it doesn't matter really even what their passing statistics are or are not. The fact that they get the offense aligned in the right formation, that they check the run left and right depending on numbers, they know how to call protections. Those things are going to make a not insignificant impact play in and play out on the effectiveness of the offense. And that's a thing we talked about a lot with Georgia. One, not only did Stetson Bennett hit passing plays that kept them efficient as an offense and kept the chains moving, but Bennett also quietly, and to most viewers being completely oblivious to it, was constantly keeping Georgia in the right play running the ball. So they almost never had a negative play. They were never running into bad numbers. They were never running into a blitz. They were never throwing into heavy coverage. Every play was kind of attacking the least resistance. That's the advantage of having a quarterback with 5 or 6 years experience. It's a rare thing in college football, and both these teams to have guys with as much experience as they do, it's going to pay dividends, and it's going to pay dividends in the little things that let you win a football game.
All right, it's picking time. And for me, I'm going Florida State 31, LSU 27. I think LSU is going to be a really good team this year, but I think those transfers are going to take a little bit of time to gel and to really mature, and they're facing an experienced quarterback, a team that can score points, and a team that's been there. And if this happens the way that if things work out the way that I'm thinking, and LSU loses this game, I'm probably not dropping them in my mind in the polls at all. And that's one of the things that's great about us doing a poll in week 4 is that's going to have LSU with a Mississippi State game and an Arkansas game under their belt after this. So for me, I've got Florida State 31, LSU 27. Tell me what you got.
I'm also going to take Florida State. I'm going to take Florida State just for the sake of argument. I'll take them 30 to 27, so slightly off your pick. It's basically the same game in my mind. These two teams are, as far as we know, pretty evenly matched. And looking into this week 1, there are so many things I don't know about these rosters that it feels incredibly difficult to make a pick. But I will say it's one in a 2.5 point spread, I think is right. I picked this game a 3-point game, so I'm picking technically picking Florida State even if they were favored to win. But it's a field goal game, which means Vegas sees this essentially as a toss-up. I think it's true. These are two real top 10 teams. These are two teams that both have a legitimate chance to make the playoff. I do agree with you, though, that going into week 1, knowing where these rosters are at, both of them took transfers, but I felt like Florida State took transfers to sort of shore up and improve the defense. And there's a lot of things we didn't talk about, right? ACC Defensive Rookie of the Year, Peyton, looking at my notes, 2 high-level, all ACC level defensive linemen joined by multiple transfers of high quality. There's a lot of positives there same sort of thing to complement LSU with, again, all conference level corners transferred in. But one of the underlying points to me is that LSU defensively last year was 51st in the country in yards per play defense. It was not a particularly good defense. And early in the year, especially, they were a little shaky in the secondary in certain places. There's a lot said around college football that continuity in the secondary is actually the highest correlation with winning. People talk about offensive line, returning starters being a big deal, but actually returning starters and continuity in the secondary is more important. Florida State is probably a little bit further ahead there as compared to LSU. And so for that reason, I give them a slight edge. But I say this noting that I'm trying to pick this blind between two teams that I think are both really good. And I don't really know which one's going to win. And then there's people going to be screaming about X player being great or Y player being great on either side. Look, it's all true. This is just a game where there's a lot of good and great players on both sides. But really unusual that mixed in among that is, probably, 8 to 10 transfers playing significant minutes over the course of a game. That's just not something that we can really project, and Vegas can't really project going into week 1. But I do think the fact that Vegas put it at 2.5 and given their ability to scout teams is pretty significant in saying that this should be a close game between two relatively evenly matched teams.
There's one little bit of a wild card factor here that nobody's talking about, and LSU fans are going to kill me for mentioning it, but Garrett Nussmeier is quietly someone who has shown he can throw the ball vertically, he can be explosive, 9.5 yards per attempt. I get that it was not in starting duty, but he did come in the Georgia game. Granted, Georgia was relaxed. There was a little bit of prevent going on there. But the flip side of all of this is if LSU wants to win now, and they see by week 3 or 4 that Jayden Daniels is good but not good enough to win them a championship, I could see them moving, or at least giving Nussmeier a shot. I know this is crazy, and I know that they're going to get me for it. But look, Jayden Daniels, maybe you talk about him improving this year. He might be who he is. He's got 4 years under his belt. And just looking at yards per attempt, I know everybody thinks that there's other stats and it doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't, but it does tell some of the story. Freshman year, 8.7. Sophomore year, 8.3. Junior year, 7.9. And last year, 7.5. He's going down every single year. Now, last year was a new system and it was in the SEC, a tougher competition. But at this point, he might be who he is. Very similar to a Jalen Hurts situation in Alabama where they knew that what they were going to get with him. They went with Tua because they needed something different. Close us out on this one with your last thoughts, Josh. Am I crazy?
I don't think you're crazy, but I'm going to say it for a slightly different reason. One of the biggest stories for LSU last year was that the offensive line took a long time to gel. Will Campbell came in as a freshman, started at offensive tackle, and the time it took for them to really kind of gel as an offensive line and for those guys to get enough experience to play at a high level was key to them being in a position to beat Alabama and make the SEC title to end the year. Those guys all came back, and they improved. Will Campbell is going to be the guy wearing number 7 now, albeit in a patch because you're not allowed to wear number 7 on your jersey. Those guys, in my opinion, were the reason why Jayden Daniels was selected as the starter to begin the year. And the reason for that is the offensive line was not consistent enough in pass protection for them to have a non-mobile quarterback starting. And the reason that they lost to FSU in large part was because there were too many pressures being given up to the quarterback. If Nussmeier had started that game, he probably would have taken several sacks. That offensive line is going to be better. And because the offensive line is going to be better, that gives them, just like we saw a little bit with Georgia, whose pass rush, frankly, wasn't fantastic, as good as the defense was. It's a big reason why Ohio State let them up. That offensive line gives them a chance to play a guy like Nussmeier, who, yeah, sure, he's a good athlete, but he's not Jayden Daniels as a runner. But if you've got a guy like him with his arm and you can actually give him some protection and let him throw the ball out of the pocket, throwing from a clean pocket, Nussmeier probably throws better than Daniels does. So I do think there's some truth to the fact that, as you said, if you need to win now or if they're in this Florida State game and the offense isn't moving the ball, it won't shock me if Nussmeier gets thrown in. Because if that offensive line takes a step forward and they can afford to have a non-mobile QB, and I truly believe that was the biggest reason why Daniels, to start the year, was selected as the starter, that gives them more options to try something different, to be a little more explosive, to make use of the receiving core that they probably do have, but we'll have to see. He could be a wrench thrown in there to try to win a football game when it matters.
All right, y'all. That's it for us. Remember, collegefootballnerds.com. Check out our website, all the stats, NFLU. Got the pick 'em ready already for you to go ahead and fill yours out. $500 prize for the winner of September. Check it out. Sign up. It's free. Thanks so much, y'all.
Let me say, if you got to this point in the video and you haven't liked and subscribed, please like and subscribe. Come on, drive our numbers up, guys.